Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to quote unquote see you and to share this time with you. So I wanted to share some thoughts today about Teshuva. And I wanted to think about it a little bit differently from the way that I think we ordinarily do think about it. So the sheets that I provided, right, are available. I see that Lauren just put the link in, and feel free to follow along. And the first source is, I think, one that represents the kind of thinking around Teshuva that is probably the most dominant and prevalent one during our times. And that is that of Maimonides, or the Rambam. And so I'll just say at the start that the liturgy and the lore around these holidays often does advance one particular model of transformation. And that really is the move from kind of sinner to saint. And Teshuva, which is usually translated as repentance, is then portrayed as the process by which one moves from their iniquitous ways to a path of, pious redemption. And it's a move from sin to salvation, usually by means of confession. Right, so the Rambam, for example, writes, Kol hamitzvot shebatorah bein aseh bein lo ta'aseh im avar adam al achat mehem bein bezadon bein b'shgaga ksheyaseh teshuva v'yashuv mechat'o chayav litvadot lifnei ha'el baruch hu. All of the commandments of the Torah, whether they be mandatory or prohibitive, if a person violates any one of them, then either, presumptuously, it's translated as presumptuously or erroneously, by mistake or on purpose, when he will repent himself and turn away from his sinful ways, he is obliged to confess before God, blessed is God. And he goes on, Ketzad mitzvadeh, how do you go about this? And he says, Omer, Ana Hashem chatati aviti pashati lefanecha. This might sound very familiar to some of us. Ve'asiti kach v'kach v'hareini chamti uboshti b'ma'asai u'lolam eini chozer ledavar zeh. How is the verbal confession made? The sinner says, I beseech thee, O great name, that's God, I have sinned, I have been obstinate, I have committed profanity against thee, particularly in doing thus and such. Now behold, I have repented and am ashamed of my actions. Forever will I not relapse in this thing again. Okay. So in essence, right, Teshuva is presented here as the antidote to bad behavior. When one returns and one turns away from sin. Right, so there seems to be a one-to-one correspondence. For every poor action, there ought to be an equal and opposite positive reaction. And should this be done correctly, fully, and methodically, right, then transformation seems to await. The evildoer will no longer be evil, and the erasure of the past seems possible. I just want to pause for a moment. I can neither see you nor can I see me. So Lauren, is there a way that I could see the face there? Just give me a few minutes that way, and maybe we can return to the text. Okay, so I share this because I think for many people it is very resonant and very much what animates this time period, namely this move away from sinful behavior. But during this particular year, during this particular time, I wonder if we might also be drawn to a different way of thinking and a different model of transformation. Not because we're all pious, perhaps, not because we don't sin in any conventional sense, but because this year, with the particular kinds of weights that I believe we are all carrying, I wonder if transformation away from sin might feel a little bit less compelling than a model that is offered by some more Hasidic thinkers. So I want to invite you to consider this alternative, a view that to my mind, is a softer, and more gentle, maybe kinder approach to tshuva. And this one really relies on the word tshuva, the root within the word tshuva being leshev, to sit or to settle. And so from this perspective, tshuva is not about undoing or stripping away, but it's actually about finding calm and ease, to rest in what Rabbi Nachman, among others, as we'll see, called Yishuv da'at, the quieting of the mind. So the state of sin on this understanding then is not about wickedness or poor action. It's actually about unsettledness. It's about anxiety and overwhelmedness and discomfort and restlessness and fear and, dare I say, some of the very emotions that many of us might be feeling right now and have been feeling in these pandemic times. And so I wonder whether the move away from that, which isn't easy and isn't simple and doesn't take a day or even 10 to get to, but is a process toward settling, toward calming, toward quieting, even in the midst of difficulty and disruption. I wonder if that actually might be something that this tshuva season might actually help us toward. So again, just to sort of bring this home a little bit, my sense is that this view of, again, quote unquote sin, and its opposite of returning from sin, which is tshuva, then, is about contending with unsettledness. It's about contending with, let's say, the sleeplessness that we might feel at night when we are considering what the next day might bring. It's about the headlines and the buzz and all of the distractions that keep us on our toes constantly. It's that feeling of vigilance of what's going to happen next. Where's the next plague coming from? What will it look like? And so the idea perhaps is that in the midst of this kind of fraught time of medical uncertainty and political uncertainty and social uncertainty and environmental uncertainty, that maybe our task this year is actually to find a way to settle, not to transform per se from sinners to saints, but to move from dis-ease, right, disease, dis-ease from ease or chaos to some kind of calm. And so I wanted to share with you some of the thinkers who actually dwell in this kind of approach. And so we begin with Rav Kook. Rav Kook, who was famously the first chief rabbi of Palestine, lived from 1865 to 1935. And he wrote a whole book about tshuva, which we'll get to in a moment. But these particular sources, just at the very beginning, or this particular source, I should say, is from Olat Raya. And he says there, Kol chet hu monea et yishuv hadat. All sin is that which prevents yishuv da'at, the settling of the mind, which is required, he says, hanidrash leha'arat razeh ha'olam. What is required to actually understand the secrets of the world, he says, is a place of settledness, is a place of inner calm. The next line I think isn't so pertinent for us because we're not here to study sfirot per se, but he says, "Tshuva hi potachat sha'arei bina kashem shehi ba'a al yedei habina." Tshuva is the process that opens the gates of understanding, or bina, and it comes through understanding. Again, we'll sort of bracket that for the moment, and just note that, right, Rav Kook here understands, right, again, sin as a kind of waywardness, but not a specific action done wrong, but an orientation to life that keeps one from seeing razeh ha'olam, that keeps one from seeing the secrets or the wisdom or the reality of the world itself. It's that which keeps us from serenity, I'd say, that which kind of disquiets our souls and disrupts our minds. It's all the stuff that throws us off balance and all that compromises our sense of equilibrium. And so I think it's worth pausing here just to note that one might think that getting clear on razeh ha'olam, or the truth of the world at this moment, is actually to really be in a place of unsettledness, since that seems to really be the reality, that we don't know what tomorrow brings, and we don't know how our loved ones will fare, or how we will fare, or where our jobs will be, or where our health will be, or where our neighbors will be. All of that seems to actually be a way of contending with the world as it is. And yet for Rav Kook, that awareness is step one, but step two is finding a way to sit within it, to find a way to sit within it with some kind of Yishuv dad, some kind of settled mind. So how do you get there? He doesn't give us a total program, but I will at least share some of the ways that he suggests that we meet the call or the challenge of unsettledness. And here it's a rather long quote that I gave you. So I think I'm gonna, as you see, I underlined, and I'm gonna just read parts, and I think I'll just do this one in English. And I'll refer back to Hebrew a little bit where I think it's important. So here, this is from Orot HaTeshuva, again, a whole book that's about Teshuva, where he delineates many different kinds of Teshuva. If you thought Teshuva was one thing, you were wrong. According to him, there are many, many different types of Teshuva. And for him, he calls this one Teshuva stamit klalit. He says, Yeshna od hargashat Teshuva stamit klalit, and now going to the English, there is another feeling of general, non-specified Teshuva. No sin or sins of the past enter one's awareness, but in general, one feels within oneself that one is very much oppressed, that one's filled with sin, that the light of God is not shining on one. And here I'm going to skip a little bit, and he says, one cannot find a way to escape this trap, which has no specific quality, but it is as though one is completely manacled. I love that phrase. It just feels so, well, heavy as it is. Right? From the midst of this bitter feeling of a spirit, Teshuva comes like a bandage of an expert healer. A powerful trust in healing and the general revival that Teshuva offers to all who cling to it causes a spirit of favor and grace to pass over one. I'm skipping again. One feels this, and with every day that passes, with the resonance, of this exalted and inclusive Teshuva, his feeling grows more certain, more clear, more illuminated by the light of the intellect, and more clear in accordance with the fundamental principles of the Torah. One becomes increasingly illuminated. Anger disappears. ... Okay, I'm gonna leave it at that from a textual standpoint, and just say that Rav Kook, who is always a poet and always a mystic, begins with this sense of undifferentiated kind of spiritual malaise, where you don't know what it is that's troubling you. It's not about this specific headline or, God forbid, this specific symptom, but just living in the light of so much uncertainty and so much, so many feelings of powerlessness, I'd say, to him is sitting in a place of chet from his perspective. Again, not something that you've done wrong, not something that even is wrong, but is a blockage to peace, to calm, and to spiritual attunement. And he says, though, that the feeling here is being trapped and manacled, right? Maybe even depressed, feeling weighed down by the world. That's the starting place. But he does imagine there being somewhere else that we can go, and that somewhere else is Teshuva. He says Teshuva comes like the bandage of an expert healer. right? To mend a broken heart and soothe the troubled mind. And the method by which one gets there, and here I'm going to admit that I do think this is rather circular. And so I think one needs to spend more time with Rav Kook to fully understand if one's looking for a program or a way out. Right, he says that the way toward Teshuva is trust in the possibility of Teshuva. Right, that the method by which one gets there is through the possibility, of trust in God and trust in God's tools, and that thus, despite one's discomfort, the trust that one may yet be comforted, the trust that there is a way through, that is the way that one finds one's way toward this greater sense of blessing. And this is a transformation, he says, from darkness to light that Teshuva offers, again, not by unburdening a person of sin, not by saying, not through confessional space of you are no longer, in the baddies category, so to speak, but is actually the hard work of finding some kind of internal peace, while being situated still in a place of difficulty and darkness. So again, there isn't a disavowal of the darkness. There isn't a need to pretend or whitewash or say it doesn't exist. But it's a claim here that the work of Teshuva is psychic, psychological, emotional work that, that isn't about some external force per se, giving us a clean slate, but is trusting in that force perhaps, or in that energy to carry us through despite the feeling perhaps of being manacled, as he says. Okay, I want to, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat. I just wanted to give us a chance to sit with that for a moment before I continue on with Robbie Nachman. So any questions or thoughts just about the move from sin to Teshuva as being not, poor behavior to release from that, but from a place of unsettledness to a place of greater internal calm. Just give it a minute. If not, I'll be happy to continue with Robbie Nachman. Lauren, you can tell me when.
Folks can mute themselves if they want for a minute.
Sure. Okay.
Erin?
Yes.
I was thinking that the word chait not only means sin, but it means to miss the mark.
Exactly.
And that maybe that ties into what you're saying, that feeling of upset, of being off base, of being off balance, is chait in its other meaning.
100%. I so much agree. And that's very much in my mind as I'm speaking. Right, so just to amplify that exact point, right, chait, which is so often translated as sin, is really a term that means missing the mark, like an arrow being shot and missing the mark. So, so that I think very much ties to some of the ideas here about feeling wayward, feeling rootless, feeling uncertain and wavering, kind of blowing in the breeze, not knowing where we're headed, I think is very much in line with this notion of chait and what it is. And I think I want to emphasize one thing, that, we often, I think, are trained, I don't know who all the we's are here because I don't know all of you, but many of us are trained right, to see and understand chet as bad and evil and right, all kinds of morally problematic things. And I'm not saying that isn't present in our tradition. Of course it is also. But this particular model, right, is not that, and I don't want to conflate them. Meaning, I think it's really important at this particular time in our, collective history, to own the importance and the reality of these feelings of unsettledness, and not to, God forbid, cast them as bad, evil. If one finds oneself depressed, right, it's certainly not a sin in that classic sense. And I really want to make that point really strongly, lest it be misunderstood. Right? So don't conflate these two understandings of sin, right? To be in a place of unsettledness is not a place for us to feel badly about ourselves, but rather an opening for an opportunity and a way out. So it's not about like moral failure, God forbid, that if you find yourself actually attuned to this moment and you feel scared and you feel fearful and you feel anxious all the time, or you feel what does tomorrow bring? That isn't a bad thing, but, says Rav Kook, right, it doesn't make you a morally bad person, but it does make you a person that is ripe for some internal spiritual work. And I imagine many of us have that work to do, which is finding a way toward greater calm, toward greater peace. And to see that as the work of this time period, and that as the work of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and a lifetime, of course. But in that sense, like the Yamim Noraim couldn't come at a better time this year. And I know that some people that I've spoken to have been otherwise finding this to be a challenging year to do the internal cheshbon nefesh, to do the internal work, sorry, I don't know how to translate cheshbon nefesh, the internal inquiry, figuring out all that we've done wrong in a time that doesn't really feel like that's perhaps of highest priority. And instead, it's just sort of finding stability and anchoring ourselves and our families and caring for those we love. That seems to be of highest priority. So again, if you're inclined to, rack yourselves and do al chayts, by all means, for all of those sins that you might find yourselves doing. But for those of you who are looking for a different kind of work this year, I offer you Rav Kook and I offer you Robbie Nachman, as we'll see in a moment, who really see the charge of this time period as being the very, very hard labor of stabilizing ourselves in times that feel unstable, trying to find a way through that. So let me turn now to Rabbi Nachman. So Rabbi Nachman of Bretzlav, a favorite Rebbe of mine, who lived from 1772 to 1810, and so thus long predated Rav Kook. He really wrote a lot about this way of viewing sin. He had a lot to say about Yishuv Dat. If anyone has studied any Rabbi Nachman, they know that he didn't have a lot of it in his life, I would say, and so really aspired to it as his kind of spiritual target, right? If it is going wayward on the or missing the mark, perhaps for him getting to the target was finding a way toward Yishuv Dat to a large degree. And I found a really beautiful passage of his, complicated passage, but a beautiful passage of his that actually ties together Teshuva, Yishuv Hadad, and actually the sounds of the shofar itself. So I thought I would share that with you. And he says, Uba'emtza tokim tru'a, shahu tru'a ushvarim, shehem genuchei ganach v'yilulei yalil, kemo she'amru rabotenu zichronam libracha. Ze bechinat ma shetzarich ata ha'adam b'hoveh, kol yemei chayav litgaber lahafoch kol minei atzvut shehem bechinat genuchei ganach v'yilulei yalil, lahafcham kulam u'simcha kanal. She'al yedei zeh ikar hatshuva, sheba'a al yedei yishuv da'at, shehu al yedei simcha. I'll translate that. In the middle, we blow a blast that is a tru'a and a shvarim, which represent moans and whimpers, ginuchei ganach v'yilulei alil, moans and whimpers, as our sages say, and that's in Rosh Hashanah 33b. This is like what a person must do all of their life to strengthen and transform all kinds of sadness that are like moans and whimpers into happiness. This is the essence of tshuva that comes through Yishuv Da'at, that itself comes through happiness. So first of all, I just want to notice that on the one hand, this source is beautiful in the ways that it actually locates the this moment in the blowing of the shofar, but as it's localizing it, it's also expanding it by saying that this is the challenge of a lifetime, right? Right? This is what a person has to do right now, but also every day of one's life, all of that, right? This is, I think, just an important way of highlighting the necessary process, right? The way that this is really a process and not just a day and not just a moment of Tkiyat shofar. But we can work a lifetime on Yishuv Da'at. We really, really can. And Rosh Hashanah and this time period in general is an opening or an intensification or an opportunity to focus on that. But it isn't something that we check off our lists and achieve on 1 day or 10 days or however we understand this, or 40, whatever this time period is for you. So for Rabbi Nachman here at Yishuv Da'at, the core of Teshuva is Yishuv Da'at, and that comes through simcha or joy. And the cries of the shofar, the moans and the whimpers that he refers to, right, they stand in for the cries of our souls that we strive to transform through simcha, through happiness. And the symbolic sounds which accompany us through Elul and then on the high holidays themselves, right, are not a call then to repent, as Rambam would have it, but an invitation to overcome psychic pain through the assertion, right, the active assertion of joy. And that for him is the work of Teshuva. Now, again, I'm again going to recognize my own limitations and maybe the limitations of these short selections too, which is that we're not provided a how-to guide. Whether it's Rav Kook telling us, well, if you believe in Teshuva, you'll get to Teshuva, or Rabbi Nachman saying, if you believe in joy, or you'll find joy. These aren't prescriptions that come with a how-to, a clear how-to guide. But I will just say this for Rabbi Nachman. Rabbi Nachman's, or an important biography of Rabbi Nachman written by Art Green is called The Tormented Master. And in contradistinction to the sometimes cultural presentation of Bretzlovers these days, oftentimes seen as ecstatic jumpers and dancers, and maybe you've seen them in the streets of Jerusalem or elsewhere, jumping up and down and singing and dancing. Rabbi Nachman himself was a tormented master, somebody who wrestled very much with joy, and again, therefore, presented it as something to be worked toward. And so when he says in this source, that the way to Yishuv Da'at is through simcha, it doesn't mean for him if you just smile a lot or if you just jump up and down, all will be okay. It's simcha for him. Joy is something that we work toward. Joy is something that doesn't come easily. Joy is something that is a spiritual practice to actually try effortfully to counter atzvut, to counter our own sadness. And let me just bring you to the next source, which talks a little bit about how we do it, or the sources for for the ways that we might be drawn in one way or another. Okay, so the next source is from Likutei Moharan, which is kind of the work, at least, that he's most widely known for. And he says there, Mash ha'olam rechokim me'Hashem yitbarach ve'inam mitkarvin elav yitbarach hu rak machmat she'ein lahem yishuv da'at. Distance from God, he says, the sole reason that people are distant from God and do not draw close to God is that they lack Yishuv Da'at, and they fail to settle their minds. Inam meyashvin atzmam. They can't actually settle themselves. V'ha'ikar lishtadel leyashev atzmo hetev. And the ikar, the essence, it is essential, sorry, that's how it's translated here, that a person strive to reflect on the purpose. No, that's not quite right. I'm gonna do that translation here for a moment, right? Lishtad v'ha'ikar, the main thing, v'ha'ikar, the main our main goal, let's say, is lihishtadel liyashev atzmo hetev. I think is just a wonderful little phrase there. Lihishtadel liyashev atzmo hetev. To try hard to sit. How hard should that be? To try hard to sit oneself, to settle oneself well. מה תכלית מכל התאוות ומכל ענייני העולם הזה, הן תאוות הנכנסות לגוף, הן תאוות שחוץ לגוף, כגון כבוד, ואזי בוודאי ישוב אל השם. And he says, and you may or may not agree, that what is it which keeps us from Yishuv dad? What keeps us distracted and pulled and undone? All the stuff which for him are kol ha'ta'avot mikol inyanei ha'olam hazeh, which you could read in very, very moralistic terms, right? All the desires we might have for this worldly things. But the examples he gives, I think, are salient. They're not, I want too much stuff, and that's what keeps me away from God. But what keeps me away from God is something like kavod, he says. The desire for too much honor, too much name recognition, too much, I don't know. I wonder what people think here. But for him, being too pulled toward kol inyanei ha'olam hazeh. Again, you can read that in very moralistic terms as that which just ties you to this world and your physical being and your, and all the gashmiut. Or I think he might be suggesting that the things that keep us alienated are those things that keep us constantly triggered by, let's say, inyanei ha'olam hazeh, the constant, the Twitter feeds or the headlines or the pace of this worldliness, being bound up with the flow of information constantly, the way in which we can become totally mired in the latest thing that was said by our president, the latest, don't mean to get too political here, but right, all that stuff, all the noise, I think he's saying, keeps us literally, right? The noise literally keeps us from finding some kind of quiet. And if we can find a way to boundary it, let's say, if we can find a way to get clear on maybe what matters and what doesn't, we might actually find a little bit of a clearing for ourselves, right? So he says that it is within our power, he says, to settle our minds through a kind of reorientation, it seems. And we can interrogate our own anxieties, and we can refocus our attentions, and we can let go of a foolish hunger. And maybe part of that foolish hunger is a desire for full certainty and a recognition that this world doesn't actually afford it. And if we can let go of that, we might actually find ourselves feeling less hurt, less unmoored, less confused. And he continues, and I think I'll stop for a moment after this. And here I'll just read the underlined parts. I'm in Likutei Maharan 10.2, part 2, 10.2. Rak al yedei hasimcha yuchal lahanhig hamoach kirtono v'yuchal liyashev da'ato ki simcha hu olam ha'chirut. Only joy enables one to direct the mind as one pleases and attain Yishuv da'at. This is because joy is the realm of freedom. And continuing on, ולבוא לשמחה הוא על ידי מה שמוצא בעצמו איזה נקודה טובה על כל פנים. The way to get to joy is to find within oneself at least one point of goodness. For Rabbi Nachman, the nekudah is important, and other Hasidic thinkers as well. The idea that there might just be some tiny spot, a dot. Others might be familiar with the phrase pintalayid. It's not exactly the same as this, but it's close. The idea that there might be some little spark or part of ourselves that might be an opening, a reminder, an anchor, maybe something that can actually help us find solid ground. And that might be one way forward. Not to imagine a full reconstituted and reorganized self. It's actually like a moment or a person or a relationship or an internal characteristic, some small way in which, right, we might hold on to something that might hold us, that might in turn, hold us steady. Right, and that for him is freedom. That's Yishuv, which is itself linked to Chevut. Right, so the way into Yishuv is through joy, by looking deep within ourselves and locating even just a tiny scintilla of strength, he says, we might begin to build a more solid sense of self, a more solid sense of having our feet on the ground in the world. And our challenge then is to, again, excavate our souls, to look inward, to locate our points of solidity and power. And then for Rabbi Nachman, and this isn't on your sheets, but he talks about really stringing these points together. Ultimately, he actually has some beautiful musical imagery, and that if we can find one note, and then another note, and then another note, we actually might find our way toward some kind of harmony again, maybe balance. Okay, let me stop there and see if there are any questions or comments, confusions. Maybe you can, Lauren, if you could just remove the screen share for a moment. Thanks. I can see people. Feel free to take yourselves off mute.
Yes. Hi. Where do we find your approach in the machzor, which seems focused on sin, the old-fashioned kind, or do we need a new machzor for these times?
Okay, that's a really great question.
That's my question.
A really, really, really great question. Okay, so here, there's like a lovely, maybe what I'm saying, but is this actually liturgically to be found? Is this how we are to experience the day of Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, for that matter? And I don't know. I do think that just like our tradition really does have a heavy emphasis on chait in the other sense and teshuva in the other sense. So too, our liturgy does reflect that more. I definitely do see that. But I also think that one way of understanding the shofar, for Rabbi Nachman at least, right, is that's when the words get blown away, right? And that's where there's, right, ironically, right, in the sounds one might find the silence, right? In the ways in which the shofar time, and I know this year different people are doing different things, but we might not have as much of an opportunity, or maybe we have more opportunity because many shuls or communities are shrinking the number of words said. Maybe this is the year without piyutim for us to actually find the power in greater silence. So I want to really agree with the sentiment that was just shared, if I understood correctly, right, that the words of the machzor do seem to push us in a different direction. And maybe that too is important. I'm not asking us to rid ourselves completely of that, but there's everything in between. Everything between the words and everything between the davening and everything. And perhaps that's what the shofar is there to do, is to interrupt that wordiness, to help us find the space for greater silence. And so maybe the dialectic of blowing shofar and saying words, and the dialectic between saying a lot of words and saying fewer words this year, maybe isn't really a push in this direction, or again, an opening or clearing to enable it to perhaps find some space.
Thank you.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
This is Charlie Hall. Thank you. This is very inspiring, and it's not a way I've looked at this before. I've always been a big Rambam fan. But if you read the literature of Alcoholics Anonymous and other 12-step recovery programs, they emphasize both the trying to make amends for individual actual acts, and there's an emphasis on prayer and meditation, coming closer to God, to ourselves, put us in a better position. Mm-hmm. So I don't see these as at all contradictory, but overlapping. And thank you for bringing this up. I've never read Rabbi Nachman, and I've found Rev Cook's poetic language to be very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and I appreciate the again the reminder here that accountability and I don't know internal work are not are not contradictory to each other, and so I think we're being called to do both simultaneously, and I think that this particular model of Teshuva that I'm presenting today is more inwardly focused, but of course the broader work of Teshuva needs to be Bein Adam L'Chaviro as well. I think the claim here, and maybe sir, you would agree that the claim here is that one relies on the other, and that in order to do the work between people and to take accountability for those that we have harmed, we also need to be able, of course, to recognize within ourselves our deficiencies and also the ways in which we've harmed ourselves, and give ourselves, as I would just say that I see this as a kind of invitation that I don't often give myself. I don't know about you, right? To forgive internally as much as externally. I think sometimes it's as hard as it is to ask people for forgiveness. There's also something really discreet about it. There are words that can be said, and there's a perhaps right, there are actions to say I did this and I did that and I'm sorry and I regret it. And we don't do that for ourselves so often, and we don't often turn inward and say where have I let myself down, and how am I getting in my own way, and how can I actually clear the way for self-love is lovely, but I mean just for settling so that, right, in the words of Rav Kook, you can actually have access to Razeh HaOlam, and there it doesn't have to be read in a totally esoteric kind of a way. Like how do we actually open ourselves to the world if we can't find just the quiet within ourselves to be able to sit with ourselves? And so maybe Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and this whole season is about doing both of those things, sitting with ourselves so that we might be able to sit with others, sit with God, etc. Okay, so I'm going to continue because I worry that we're running out of time a little bit. But it very much ties to all the comments that were just made, so I appreciate that. So I just want to sort of bring us back and see that the models of Teshuva that are offered by Rav Kook and Robbie Nachman really foreground notions of trust and belief and joy and inner strength as the keys to transformation. And it seems that if we could just, work hard enough to overcome negative thinking, we just might find our way out of like existential anxiety. But of course, it's really hard to get to a place of Yishuv Dad. As I said, I think for Rabbi Nachman, it was really the task of a lifetime. And so I wonder if we might actually need to cultivate, right, a whole other skill set. And to the question about like, where is this in the Machzor? I'm not sure that it is, but I do think that the larger choreography of the Yamim Noraim makes space for this. And I guess I just wanted to, something that I didn't say before that's just occurring to me now is that when we talk about, right, Elul to Yom Kippur is a 40-day process. And we only find ourselves in shul, formally speaking, meaning doing the work of Teshuva. Okay, I shouldn't say that. I'm sure many of you are morning million people, but I just mean when we used to do that, that is. But the formal work of Teshuva, as was referred to in terms of the Machzor, right? It's like 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and 1 day of Yom Kippur. It's 3 days. But this process, right, we understand to be at least a 40-day process. So what are you doing the other 37 days? I think is the question. And so I felt challenged by the question about the Machzor, and I really appreciate it. But I'm also sort of coming back and thinking, you know what, you're right. The Machzor asks us to do one kind of work, but what are we doing the 37 other days? So yes, we have liturgy there and we have slichot, and so there are words that can fill it all, but maybe what we don't often think about is all that in between time that actually is, just in terms of, sheer quantity, it really is bigger than, more than that very focused, intense time period. So maybe the work of Yishuv Dad and learning to settle is actually perhaps a bigger part and maybe a harder part of this larger transformation process. Okay, so, with that in mind, right, I do think that we need to understand what these characters might mean by sitting. And for those of you who are maybe practitioners of sitting meditation, maybe far more skilled than I am, you might recognize some kind of affinity here between practices of tshuva and meditation, which I understand, right, is not so simple. It's not so easy to sit. It's not so easy to sit. And so learning to settle, learning to sit is really a skill. And so I just wanted to share with you one reflection on sitting, brought to us through the lens of the character in Tanakh who is known as a sitter, and that is Yaakov. Yaakov Ishtam Yoshev Ohalim. Yaakov, the one who sat, Yoshev, or dwelled, or settled, depending upon your translation, sat in tents. So I will already note the irony, or at least the paradox, right? That Yaakov, who is known as our Yisrael, the struggler, right? He seems like anything but a character who can sit, and yet he's introduced in this way. So, and there are a lot of different translations of this and midrashic understandings that maybe Yaakov was a quiet man, or maybe he was a homebody, maybe he was a yeshiva bacher, right? That's a famous midrash that he's sitting in the Beit Midrash of Shem Ve'ever. But there is another interpretation also of the more mystical, Kabbalistic bent that focuses on where this sitting took place. And Yaakov here is presented as a person that is seated between two tents, the tent of Abraham and the tent of Yitzchak. Or again, sort of Kabbalistically construed, he sits between the power of chesed, of Abraham, of loving kindness, and din, judgment, identified with Yitzchak. So I bring you a short piece from Rabbi Yosef Gigatia, it's just a fun name to say, a 13th century Spanish Kabbalist, and in his book Shari Ora, he writes the following: V'Yakov ishtam Yoshev Ohalim, klomar Yaakov hu sod hamidah ha'emtzait, k'mo hatiyomet shebelulav shemetayem shnei hatzadim ba'emtza, kach Yaakov metayem shnei ha'ohalim, shehem ohel Avraham shehu chesed ve'ohel Yitzchak shehu din. Yaakov was an innocent man, or a simple man, whatever Tom is, it's a whole other lovely class, dwelling in tents. This is to say that Yaakov represents the middle way. Like the tie of the lulav, I love this, if you think about a lulav and the sort of the bamboo threading around it, apparently this was something in the 13th century too. So it's like the tie of the lulav that holds the two sides of the hadassim and the aravot together in the middle. So Yaakov held two tents, the tent of Abraham, which was one of chesed, and the tent of Yitzchak, which was one of din. And he goes on, V'zehu sod v'Yaakov ishtam Yoshev Ohalim. This is the secret of Yaakov ishtam. Kimat sorach lamar Yoshev Ohalim. Why did the text have to say Yoshev Ohalim in the plural? Sits in tents. Hayalo lamar Yoshev Ohel. Yaakov sat in a tent. Why tents? Elamidat Yaakov omedet bein shnei Ohalim. Because Yaakov is all about sitting between tents. Umitayemet umeachazet yamin v'smol b'midah ha'emtzait. And he ties together the right and the left with this middleness. Looking at how it's translated here. Sorry, I'm doing it extemporaneously. Ad shenimtzeu Avram v'Yaakov ne'achazim Avram v'Yitzchak, ne'achazim v'Yaakov. Right, so this teaches that Yaakov's essential characteristic was to stand or to sit between two tents and to hold them together, the right and the left, such that Avram and Yitzchak were bound together in him. So this character of Yaakov, right, known largely as a kind of consummate struggler, was actually, according to the Shari Ora, at his core, that quiet, inward, and integrated balancer. He existed between competing poles, and you can take the text off now, please. He existed between competing poles and varied ways of being, and conflicting legacies and turmoil with God and with human beings, What did Yaakov do? He learned somehow how to sit between them, to hold paradoxes and to unite opposites, and somehow to maintain trusting commitment, even, and here I'm purposefully mixing narratives, even when it left him limping and wounded, right? So sitting isn't always a pain-free experience. So the Yishuv dat, or the inner peace that Yaakov cultivated from his early days, it seems here, was hardly a simple complacence. It seems something like a very dynamic striving toward integration, toward a yeshiva, a kind of stillness, precariously perched between camps. And so I wanted to sort of bring us here, because what we might see from here is that sitting in any form is not easy, and it's not static. It's not carefree, and it's not simple-minded. It's not complete release from all that is weighty, but instead, as construed this way at least, it's a dynamic way of being in the world that holds tension and somehow rests gently within it, that exists between the poles of the world and stays centered somehow amidst it all. And so as children of Yaakov, as Bnei Yisrael, we might strive somehow to live in the light of this weighty legacy. So I guess I'll just maybe end, and hopefully we'll have time for maybe a few questions. Which, yeah, I'll end just with a phrase that we say often in this time period, when we say slichot at least, right? Hashivenu Hashem elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem, hashivenu, return us. So in the spirit of everything that we have looked at today, whether we are literally sitting and meditating or figuratively sitting in the songs and the words of the liturgy, I think one way of understanding those words and that aspiration, instead of return us and make us free of sin, is settle us. Hashivenu Hashem, settle us, O God, and we will settle. Calm us, O God, and we will be calmed. Help us to slow down and to rest, and to find a way through our tshuva to Yishuv dat. So I will end there and ask if there are any questions or comments.
I was just thinking the last piece we read, how in Vayeshev, the whole thing about that he thought he was going to settle down, and instead there are all these complications, and maybe that's part of how this really is hard work. Mm-hmm. And I think that Norah, right, when we say Kel Gadol Gibor v'Norah, I think Norah is linked to Yaakov, no? So it's
maybe.
Yeah. I don't know, but anyhow, but that this sitting and this integrating is not an easy process.
Right.
It's linked to Norah with Yaakov saying when he sees the ladder, Manorah hamakom hazeh.
Yes, thank you. Great.
Great, thank you.
Beautiful. There's a midrash on Vayeshev that has always unsettled me, which says, I hope I'm quoting it correctly, but something like Bikesh Yaakov leishev b'shalva. Miyad kafatz alav rogzo shel Yaakov Avinu, no, shel Aviv, sorry. Shel Aviv. Or that Yaakov wanted to sit b'shalva, but God said, no, you can't sit b'shalva. You actually, that's maybe for the next life. This sitting looks different. This sitting is going to require a little more struggle, which I find hard. I think it's hard to make space for a spiritual language that sees shalva, serenity, which happens to be the name of my son, Shalev, which sees that as not an end in and of itself to pursue, because serenity maybe is identified with complacence, I don't know. But to see Yaakov as someone maybe who struggled with what it means to be this harmonizer, balancer, kind of tense, intense sitter, right? He wanted something that was easy and sweet, and he wanted to be able to live perhaps by looking away. But that wasn't his fate. And his fate was to be a Yoshev Ohalim, to always live between places, to feel pulled, but somehow to learn how to rest there. And I just think that that's a very interesting way of imagining the task at hand. Not to look away and not to find easy solutions. There are none, of course, we know that. But to nevertheless cultivate, dafka, to cultivate some way of sitting with and between this degree of uncertainty is maybe what our spiritual work ought to be focused on right now. So I'm just going to read what Lauren said here.
Oh, there's no need to read that.
Oh, there's no need to read that. Okay. So I think our time is up. Is that right, Lauren?
I believe you have 2 minutes left.
Okay, so if anybody wants to share anything, I would love to take any final questions or comments. And if not, we'll say, may we all find some Yishuv dad.
I'll just say thank you. It was really inspiring and meaningful.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for being here, everybody.
That was wonderful. Can I ask the gentleman who talked about the AA groups emphasizing both the sins, accountability, and what was the other, the inward focus you mentioned, but what did he mention?
I think that was me. What's specifically your question?
You had said that the AA groups, etc., emphasize both aspects, basically, of the tshuva we're talking about, the sins and your account, and the word focus. But you mentioned, you phrased it differently.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly how I phrased it, but prayer and meditation are specifically mentioned in the 12 steps. Making amends is also specifically mentioned. Having a spiritual awakening is also specifically mentioned. And turning things over to God is also specific. All those are specifically mentioned. There you go. Someone just gave a link there. I think at least the United States, the first 164 pages of the Alcoholics Anonymous book are in the public domain and available online.
Thank you so much.
And there you go. There's the link.
Great. Thank you, everyone, so much.